Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 34 team selection. As you guys know, I did decide to pursue a free at 33 strategy, so that just means I'm on a little bit of a different path from everyone else. And thanks to the lovely man that is João Pedro, I'll also have to take a -4 to get towards a team of 11, whereas previously, of course, I would have just had 2 transfers to make and probably had actually a really solid team for Game Week 34. But that's FPL sometimes, so credits to João Pedro. Also, thank you and shout out to Trossard, who I owned for a long time with the sort of Arsenal B team, doing absolutely nothing for 7-8 game weeks in a row. And in his recent stints has just been absolutely electric across the board. So that's really been enjoyable. But I think free hit wise, just reviewing the free hit in Game Week 33, it was actually a pretty fun game week, pretty topsy-turvy. At one point, I think I felt really bummed about the free hit because sometimes when you press the free hit button, you feel quite optimistic about the team. You've got a new lease of life, don't have to own these players long term, which I think was part of the strategy as well, right? The whole idea of owning Arsenal players that might be rotated over the course of the season, like Saka, as they sort of pursue their Champions League ambitions. With City as well, just not really being able to kind of put a finger on or a lid on really what the best triple City lineup is. Right now, it does seem like KDB actually could be quite the permanent piece up until the end of the season. Guardiola Marmoush still strong, depending on the Haaland timeline. Moving from, let's say, Henderson to Martinez, especially after experiencing Henderson last week, but then getting the swing the other way wasn't so great. But in the free hit, obviously there were positives, right? We had Rashford, we had Rodgers. I was close to actually going Bowen as well between Rashford, but that doesn't really matter. It's not had a single impact in my team. I think quite fortunately as well, Bowen probably was actually hindsight the better pick just in terms of the minutes. I kind of understated Mateta's or Watkins' minutes in comparison to Mateta. I probably should have baked in Mateta being rotated versus Arsenal, and that's probably on me. Other than that, I think I'm pretty happy with the free hit. I think Kyrgios obviously was a huge slice of luck, which is nice, but you need that from time to time. And I think with KDB, for example, playing the minutes that he did, not actually getting anything within 2 relatively good fixtures, I would say that's not so nice. And the captaincy as well was a bit of a flop, but also fortunate that Saka flopped harder and missed a lot of chances in the previous game too. So that's kind of the Game Week 33 summary. 75 points, that shoots me up a little bit in the world, 133k. Unfortunately, as I said, credit to João Pedro, he somehow managed to ruin my free hit even without being on it. And that's because I've come back to a team that's basically an extra man down. And so we're now looking at a Game Week 34 where we have to make more transfers than I probably would have done. At the same time, I think what's nice about this game week is that 11th man, whoever I bring in, is also someone I don't really feel bad about bringing in, because I was always going to sort of bring myself down to 0 transfers this week. And so there's no sort of excess, I suppose, value of being able to roll this week compared to in previous weeks. And we have so many good fixtures on display across the board. I still also need to make the right transfer in terms of someone who actually has relatively good amounts of fixtures, good amounts of minutes up until the end of the season. And I think we've really slimmed down in terms of the picks that are able to do that from now to the end. Like even the Palace mids that I think a lot of people want to sell, I mean, they arguably are players that we could keep until the end of the season. Bournemouth now I think is quite high in our estimations, regardless of whether they double or blank, just because a lot of their players are nailed, they're cheap, and I can fill out the squad quite easily. When I look at a team like Arsenal, United, Tottenham, other teams maybe a bit more invested in the FA Cup, there's going to be mass rotation, and we're going to see that going forwards. And I think that's also going to change how, and we can see that already, I think, even within this week, where clearly the markets are also being reflective of the sort of rotation being baked in. So something to be said. And my transfer plans, unfortunately, have also changed because Mbeumo got a price rise that actually kind of hit me across the face. I wasn't expecting it. I also wanted just simply more information. We're trying to close out with the end of the season, maximize our transfers, probably bringing this as solid as picks as possible since I'm not on a free hit. So I'm in a position now where I've been priced out of one of my transfer plans, which was to go triple Bournemouth, which was Evan Nilsson, Semenyo, and Kluivert, who's already in my team. But I can't do that anymore because Mbeumo got a price rise. So did Ait Nuri. And the forward pool, I think I've reconsidered a little bit in terms of what my potential moves are. I think we've opened ourselves up to a lot of options. I think even for the free hit template for 34, a lot of people are actually looking at that. And keep in mind, I've made a video for a free hit 34 template. The only thing I'd probably change on that video specifically is that I would maybe suggest that the likes of Luis Diaz would definitely probably fit into a draft like that, and even Trent, for example, would fit on the free hit draft. And probably I'm a little bit lower in Sessegnon based on the sort of Marco Silva news, and at the same time equally higher on Raul Jimenez because Muniz's injury seems like it's probably going to keep him out, actually probably at least 2 weeks now, just listening to Marco Silva's press conference comments. So that's kind of the position we're at. I myself need to make, as I said, slightly more robust transfers, so it's not just this week in mind and maximizing these games, like for example, opponents like Southampton, Leicester, and Ipswich, which obviously I can't do anything about because I got triple Newcastle, but more specifically picking players who have a good fixture this week and beyond. So if I jump into my Game Week 34 team, I think what's nice, of course, is we always can have the opportunity to look at data and sources of data as well as projected numbers, right? So if you look at the link in the description below for Fantasy Football Hub, I've got a personalized link there, and you can find this week a lot of things that might actually suit whatever strategy you're on. You have, for example, the optimal AI team. You also have the opportunity to look at the predicted points for all players in Game Week 34 to try and see, you know, what are the competing options this week from, you know, a modeling perspective that could feature quite well on the sort of hub selection of picks and what could combat those hub selection of picks quite well. At the same time, we have just the ability to sort of take a step back and look at the fixtures as a whole. Looking at, for example, Rob T's market odds for teams this week, we have lots of options. And I spoke about this a little bit within my free at 34 video, because I think there's actually just so many options and so many moving parts. But specifically for me, because I want players who are probably playing for teams like Brighton, Brentford, and even Bournemouth, because I think actually going towards the end of the season, and Nottingham Forest as well, these are the teams that actually I think have really good fixtures, are probably going to rotate very, very little. Maybe Nottingham Forest will rotate a bit more because we just naturally see more rotation from Nuno Mendes. He's a manager who loves early substitutions, and they probably have to rotate around the FA Cup for this week specifically. But clearly we have a lot of great options. So I look at the odds, and clearly, of course, this Newcastle and Liverpool attack I'm not very invested into. I've got double Newcastle defense. At the same time, I don't own Luis Diaz, so that's going to be a big miss on the free hit. When I look at, let's say, some of the sort of top clean sheet teams, Wolves, Chelsea, no surprise, a lot of people are going to be on Aït-Nouri and Cucurella, all great picks. On the Brighton side, I'm just hoping for the absolute best here with someone like Estupiñán. And of course, I've got an option, for example, to go for someone like Welbeck. But I've also mentioned, as I said, a lot of these Bournemouth players who have a pretty good fixture this week. And I think a lot of people will actually look at the graphic here and just think it's so curious that Bournemouth actually have such high expected goals versus a team like United, who are still better than the likes of Leicester, the likes of Ipswich. And I think part of that actually is just simply because we are starting to see more United rotation. So even though I think United will probably go first string for this game because they kind of went second string for the previous one, it's also very likely that a lot of their players will be subbed off, 60, 70 minutes. So they're actually adequately rested for the Europa League match. Similar to, for example, a team like Arsenal would be in Game Week 35 when they actually face off versus Bournemouth themselves, and that game is sandwiched between both PSG legs. So something to mention, as I said, that's super relevant is the idea that we're just, I guess, taking these on the beach narratives on the face of it and just hoping that a lot of players who just play good minutes are just going to do well for us. And I think there's going to be a lot more variability in terms of outcomes of who we pick and who's going to actually deliver the points for us on game weeks like this. For my own team, if we step back from a defensive point of view, just jumping into my defense, I don't plan to make a defensive transfer. I was previously suggesting that I could go Sessegnon. I'm a little bit lower than that now. I was considering Ryan Aït-Nouri, but he's already gotten a price rise. And also, I think it's a good opportunity maybe to just ignore him because his ownership is going to be so high from the free hitters. Why not go for picks that are actually going to be less owned? And that's why I'm still quite drawn towards the idea of going for Semenyo in the midfield position as my 11th attacker, or not attacker rather, but 11th player, compared to someone like Ryan Aït-Nouri, who's a little bit more of a defensive move, I would say, on my part. So the defense that I'm going to be fielding out this week is going to be a defense of Pope, Trippier, Estupiñán, and Nico Williams. At the very least, these are all teams, or players rather, who are playing at home, which I think is a huge boost. We did see some of the odds previously for Brighton and Nottingham Forest. They're not as good, clearly, as some of the free hit sort of contending clean sheet odds on offer, but they're not too bad, right? Estupiñán, I think, is not too far behind. He also has some sort of attacking threat. Nico Williams equally too, so hopefully he can deliver the goods. I think he's been quite a differential pick for me as of late. Not many people could own a Nottingham Forest defender, I would say, probably on a week like this, where the free hit is so popular and they're probably a less popular pick to go for. So I'm looking forward to that. As far as the midfield, shifting gears towards that, there's going to be a huge debate over the Salah captaincy this week, and I think I'll probably save that for the end of the video. But Kluivert, Palmer are going to be a part of this team, and I'll be selling both of my Crystal Palace midfielders. I just think, the way I see it, yes, of course, Crystal Palace have a chance of doubling Game Week 36, but equally so do, for example, a team like Bournemouth. So I'm planning to bring in Semenyo for Sar, which kind of trades doublers, but gives me a probably prospectively higher chance of a double. Keep in mind as well, whilst Crystal Palace in theory have a chance to double, it's actually quite likely if Crystal Palace were to advance towards the FA Cup finals that, their matchup specifically versus Wolves actually still goes towards Gameweek 37, just looking at some of the fixture predictor predictions. They think that because, of course, Crystal Palace are not involved in any other competition, unlike, for example, Tottenham, right, who face off versus Aston Villa and could, of course, get themselves to the FA Cup finals if they beat Villa, or Crystal Palace, sorry. If Villa were to, for example, let's say, advance to the FA Cup finals, then Game Week 36 is actually almost a certainty because they cannot play this match versus Tottenham because Tottenham will kind of need that spot booked up for Game Week 37 midweek, and that's quite important. Whereas with Crystal Palace, they don't have this sort of same threat. And so I think selling off the Crystal Palace mids is fine. I think their fixtures versus Bournemouth actually match up worse, even though Bournemouth still have, for example, an Arsenal game in hand. What I'll also say is that, fortunately, as I said, that Arsenal or that Bournemouth game in hand in Game Week 35 is sandwiched between the PSG game. So I really think that this Arsenal team will probably not care so much about the outcome of this Bournemouth game. We've already seen that Crystal Palace have gotten a pretty good result versus Arsenal, and they actually weren't going very, very strong for most of the game, the majority of the game. And they were able to actually secure a draw as soon as they put sort of Mateta and Sarr on the pitch. So that's kind of the position of that transfer. Now, Mbeumo is a bit of a, I think, not the best transfer this week, but I just think long-term, being able to actually utilize this price point, Mbeumo is just that strong, right? Compared to the likes of Eze, regardless of the chances of doubling or not. Mbeumo won't have a chance to double. He'll just have singles left for the rest of the season. But as I've sort of been reiterating within the cheat sheet, he's just such a strong pick, probably the third best player within the game that we have right now up until the end of the season. And I think I'm including even the likes of Isak, for example, and I'm sort of putting Mbeumo a little bit ahead of him because you've still got fixtures like Man United at home, Ipswich away, Wolves away, and then even, for example, the tougher games like Fulham are at home. And so the only tough game really this week, right, with Nottingham Forest, where hopefully you'd think Brentford with 10 days rest, Nottingham Forest with much less rest, potentially even, exerting themselves a lot within this City game in the FA Cup final, could actually mean that we can enjoy potentially an Mbeumo haul in this situation. So that's kind of where I'm at with regards to that. And 2 transfers have been made already, as you guys know. And then there's obviously a -4 on the cards. In terms of the midfielders as well, I think the chance, as I said, to move to Semenyo is quite nice because the ownership of all the other players that are the likes of Ryan Nuri, maybe even Sessegnon if I made a transfer for him, would have been extremely high. So I feel like I didn't really want to go for a pick that was that high up in terms of effective ownerships potentially for a game week like this. And I can own a pick that I think is going to be strong and stable for the rest of the season. Semenyo has probably been, a cardio enthusiast, a yellow card merchant, and not much production really created from him. But I still think he's a very solid pick. Underlying is still really strong. Minutes are still really strong. And you're just going to have to, I'm going to have to hope that he hits a run of form, hopefully, at this juncture in the season, where arguably, some European spots are still in play for a lot of these Premier League teams, despite, how they're somewhat in mid-table, with Brighton and Brentford all sort of in contention for potentially like an 8th spot within the league, where you could still get European football. So quite a positive from that perspective. In the front line, I'll be going with Welbeck. So it's not the best thing in the world to go take a -4 from João Pedro to Welbeck because it's the most sideways move ever, but João Pedro simply won't play for the next 3 matches and Welbeck will, and he'll probably be on penalties. The alternative really, as I said, within my transfer plans would have been to go for Evan Nilsson, and I think, both of them are heartbreaking for different reasons, right? Evan Nilsson was someone that I was pretty close to getting on the wild card, and then João Pedro on the flip side of it is someone who, I don't really want to be getting rid of for basically the same player for the same sort of value point, I suppose, with Welbeck, who's a little bit older, has that sort of old man tax where sometimes you see Welbeck, getting knocks here and there, missing games, getting subbed off early regardless, not even starting matches, despite there not being striker competition. But I'll have to sort of take the punt for what it is. Raul was also sort of on the cards, especially after the Muniz press conference comments from Marco Silva. But I think that Welbeck is probably still the better option just because the next 2-3 fixtures are better than Fulham's in totality, whilst I recognize that this week, Raul's numbers are better. And so I think to kind of take account of that as well, I think Rob T's sort of goal scoring predictions are actually very helpful in this case, right? You can see that on the top projected goal scorers that Salah's top, Isak close behind, and then Raul's actually third top, and then Welbeck's right behind. And it's curious because I think a lot of people are going for Cunha, but I think part of this is because, look, if the goal threat is already that high, we know Cunha's way more assistive or creative rather than the likes of Raul and Welbeck. So I think that's a huge plus, and why Cunha is such a popular pick on this week. Strand Larson not too far behind, not on penalties as well, might I add. And Evan Nilsson not too far behind as well. So, and Palmer, who I probably won't even mention. And I haven't even talked about Palmer really within the midfield, but he's taken a pretty big and sharp fall from grace. I think there's this obviously positional change aspect to Maresca and Palmer recently, but still for whatever reason, I guess the market still rate him. And I think I'm not going to try and overcorrect, I suppose, how we've responded, models, markets, how we have on the eye test. I know he hasn't scored a goal since January, I believe, which is absolutely freaky. Maybe he scored it within European competition, but certainly not within Premier League. And I'm just going to have to hope, obviously, with the sort of rolling team that I have, that someone like Palmer, who plays more minutes than Saka and Foden, ends up being the right decision, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. But crucially, I think when you look at a table like this, Welbeck's actually very much well rated because of the natural impacts of what happens when you gain penalties, most likely, as I said. And I think the markets are pretty much implying that as well within that direction. But it's such a good game week to go for Raul. I'll be quite sad to miss out on him because I think he'll be relatively low owned, as he's not been super popular compared to the likes of Isak and Cunha. But he's probably actually the most popular third pick right now on the free hit. And that's interesting. So I'm going for Welbeck personally because I think I can probably guarantee that his minutes are great. Raul's also had very minor competition from Carlos Vinicius. He's not actually played that well this season. So I think there was a point in time when I think about, my sort of approach to analytics and Raul, maybe for the first half of the season, his baselines were really strong. His expected, or rather non-penalty expected goals per 90 was actually very, very good and matched up extremely well against the strikers and were better probably than some of the most expensive strikers in the game. But as the season has panned out, and as we know, the data tends to obviously reach a mean, it has sort of trended downwards. And part of that could just be, unfortunately, Fulham have had so many injuries within attacking positions, right? Like long-term injuries, like for example, like Reece Nelson, etc. Smith Rowe sort of being in and out of games. You could argue, I suppose, the overall level of their attacking quality has dropped, whilst their defense has sort of gone from stride to stride. And unfortunately, of course, Raul's sort of NPXG right now is much lower than it was previously. I think it's now within the 30s, which is very, very low, I think, right? It's kind of at that Wood level where you really need to be an extremely overperforming finisher to be, considered a strong striker. Obviously, penalties help a lot with that because it kind of gives you an artificial inflation to how prospectively good a player is. And I think that's fair because we've seen it, right? Raul got 2 penalties, for example, versus Ipswich. You tend to get them versus the weaker opponents. And that's a totally fair point. So I still would like to go for Welbeck, and I'm just going to hope that it works out for myself within this transfer. When it comes to captaincy, though, just to kind of close out this video, I think what's so interesting is Salah, we can argue, has been out of form. And I think I within my wildcard 30 draft was quite adamant in going for Salah because I was pretty convinced that Saka's minutes were poor, that Foden's minutes were poor. But then on the wildcard 31 draft that I suggested to some people who were on that trajectory, I did suggest the idea that maybe you can go without Salah anyways. I think in hindsight, because all the medium price players under him have played less minutes, that probably was hindsight the wrong decision. But he's not played, or at least gotten the results that I think a lot of people would have expected for someone who's playing 89 minutes a game for this Liverpool team, who still has really good baselines and still a lot to play for, I suppose, in terms of consolidating the league, maybe potentially, of course, setting records as well at one point in time for himself individually, but then also within, just being up in the annals of history from a points perspective. But, he's not, for whatever reason, he's not delivered the goods. Recently, for example, the Leicester match was actually a huge miss in terms of a lot of chances and opportunities. But there were also games like recently with the Everton match where he didn't produce any data. I think part of it, too, is sometimes just things correct like that, or not even correct like that, but actually just things can flow and ebb in certain directions. And I think whilst it was clearly the right decision to own Salah, I think it just proves to me this season as well, in terms of captain season, in terms of big swings like that I think it's totally okay to expect that these players are human and that they can't sort of maintain some absolutely insane level of production, especially if, let's say, the underlying data is only supporting a significant level of production. So I think for the course of the season, his goal and assist per 90 has sort of far superseded his sort of total non-penalty expected goal involvement. And I think the biggest piece on Salah historically, if you ever look at him, is that for the most part of his career, he's actually been a slightly above average finisher, but clearly is the best midfielder ever. And he's not a midfielder, right? He's effectively just a right winger. But even from a winger standards, or inside forward standards, if you want to call it like that, probably the best player in the world at actually getting chances consistently, so arriving into the right positions. And so, yeah, we've arrived at a spot where I think a lot of people might be cooling off on Salah, but the markets, for whatever reason, are still extremely high on him. And maybe it's a little convenient. I think that Isak has also fallen out of form himself. But you'd think that, with Ipswich at home, that Isak should have higher goal scoring odds than Salah. And he doesn't. And I find that very curious, because I'd probably take the chances with Isak on most cases, but his minutes have been a bit fragile recently. I feel like he's been playing less minutes in most games. Wilson's gotten a fair share of minutes. Maybe he's still sort of dealing with almost a knock of sorts. Salah's minutes have been perfect. And, I guess Tottenham still are pretty imperfect as a team, because they'll continue to rotate as well. And I think, as I said previously, there's definitely an element towards the markets baking in for teams like Arsenal, teams like United, teams like Tottenham to be rotating at these games before their bigger European matches, which are, their targets and their aims for the season. So I'm going to captain Salah myself. I don't think there's anything wrong with going for vice captain Isak. I think at this point in the time as well, we're only a few game weeks up until the end of the season. I can understand why someone might want to take an even larger risk here and actually go for a differential captaincy as well. But I think it's quite firmly in the favor of Salah. I'll take my chances here. I think they're going to try win the league, if we want to put it like that. And hopefully Salah plays a huge part into that. And I'll just be captaining him, because I think my team's already very, very different from other people's. I feel like I've got so much risk in so many different directions. I don't necessarily need to take another risk in this specific game week, especially when I think actually the projected numbers for Salah aren't close enough to Isak to even warrant going for the Isak captaincy, particularly when I think Isak's minutes could be a little bit lower than probably the markets would predict. And that's kind of just the position that I'm at right now with captaincy. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys soon for more content. Take care and goodbye. And I'm also excited to say that I'll definitely be live streaming this weekend. So hope you guys, have a good end to the work week or a week in general. And I'll see you guys there on the live stream.